So the Shrenis that you talked about,
Correct.
it in this dharmic ecosystem, they existed then. Do they exist now across these Southeast Asian countries?
No, because now, especially after the...
Informally,
Correct,
I'm talking
informally.
about.
I mean,
Yeah.
they don't exist informally, but their sort of footprints are there. In the sense, when you go and analyze some of these places and try to see linkages of what happened, you would always, move into one of these guilds. Not just the Ainu River. For example, there's another guild called...
Who the 500? Ainur is 500. So
Correct.
who are the 500?
It was just a group of people in Karnataka who had started it, kept the name as 500.
Oh, okay.
It wasn't like a specific... But it's supposed to be a group of 500 people, right?
Okay.
Put it that way.
Oh, I thought there are 500 trades or whatever.
No, I think the members were 500 people,
Okay.
which led them to create the name of 500. And another thing is, see, these Shrinis were also... They had their own constitution, right? They had their own governance techniques.
So they're like unions?
Correct. No, I would call them corporations.
Corporations.
Yeah, it's sort of a multinational corporation, put it that way, but in a scale probably much lesser than what we are today. But for those times, it was still something that was significant, and they had their own governance structure, and each of them had their own sort of unique governance structure. And these governance structures are also based on the idea of dharma. Like they used to have certain principles for each of their guilds, how they want to function. Because see, all these guilds are very, very egalitarian, right? They were very inclusive. They had people across walks of life. As long as you had some commercial sort of background, you could enroll yourself here. And then so their approach was very open-minded. So that is one of the reasons why they were also quite inclusive enough to go across the world, right? To do a lot of these activities. So their perspective was very different. So what I'm trying to say is the common people's engagement with the world was far more sort of I would say influential long term in terms of the ideas and cultural exchanges than even say what the institutional or the monarchs were trying to do.
So also when you go to these countries, we don't know, for most lay people, you don't know how is it so similar to back home.
Right.
Especially for people from South India, when they go, how is it so similar? Of course, people will say, oh, okay, the food, the temples and things like that. But there's a whole ecosystem around that. You have a temple and you realize that there is a lane which is selling jewelry. Right? They have rubies and emeralds and diamonds, and you see the jewelry, there is similarity to some of the South Indian jewelry. Right next to that will be another lane where there are craftsmen, there's a crafts bazaar.
Right.
You go further down or you see another gully, that linkages. So, the word Shreni is actually also that.
Right.
There are various linkages like this, and this is what runs all through Southeast Asia. Anybody going to these places.
Right.
So when you start talking about temples in the Chola, Pallava, Pandya and the Vijayanagara and the whole ecosystem around that, it is similar in all these countries, right? So take us through that now.
Definitely, right? Because you see, the similarities are a couple of things. One is the architecture, right? So the architecture that these temples follow, some of them is a combination of Dravidian architecture. Some of them is combination of North Indian architecture. But the temple structure,
Northeastern.
Correct, northeastern.
More than north.
Correct.
I've seen Assamese and
Correct.
those Manipur, Tripura.
Correct, because that's where the Mon Khmer, who are the origins. Correct, they're the ones who are sort of origins of before the Funan Empire. They trace some of their roots to that. So there are similarities in terms of the architecture, right? So and the grandness of these temples and monuments. Two is what I call the way of life, right? Which you talk about in terms of food, in terms of culture, in terms of exchanges, in terms of festivals, right? I mean, Kartik Purnima, for example, is celebrated across these places because a lot of them were trading from Orissa, or the coast of Orissa and Kalinga and all these places into Southeast Asia. So even today, you find that a lot of these, kingdoms still practice some of these, traditions that we have. So the second part of similarities is in the cultural exchanges, in terms of food, in terms of, their the so-called way of life that we're talking about, right? So these two similarities are very, very, stark, put it that way. Third is just the, you share, when you go to these places, right? I mean, let me give you an example. So I was one of my sort of first people whom I dealt with this book almost 10, 15 years back was with Dr. Nagaswamy, late Dr. Nagaswamy, who's a, world-renowned archaeologist. He spent decades working on this subject. In fact, he's one of the persons whom I dedicate this book to because, the work that he's done was amazing. So he used to tell me that in Cambodia, every village had a Shiva temple or a Shivling temple at some point of time. But when I was traveling through Cambodia, I think you'd also realize that as you walk through, you will see Shivlingas like every other place.
Yeah.
So,
in fact, you say this, that the Khmers owe their heritage to Kamrup, I'm quoting,
correct,
which is modern-day Assam in northeastern Bharat. Northern Cambodia, which is today's Laos, used the sea routes for trading. And then you go on to explain about details. Go on.
yeah.
Yes.
So what I'm trying to say is, in a physical sense, though these temples were not non-functional, you get a sort of a very strong feeling that there is a lot of correlation to where we came from, and it's physically seen, right? And that is another sort of element, because most of these similarities we feel through other experiences, but when you see it in a very stark way, I think it sort of appeals to you even more.
And those who own, I've seen in many of these, like for example, in Cambodia or in Laos, they still refer to as Kamboja.
Correct.
The Indians or the people of Indian origin who are like 4th, 5th generation who have lived there, they speak the local language. They practice Indian customs as well as local customs, but they still say Kamboja. There are people in Thailand who will still say Sham.
Correct.
For when they talk about, we in India have forgotten about it.
Right.
We call it Siam or we say Thailand, but they will still use some of them still talk like that.
Right.
And it comes as a shocker sometimes, like when you're in Bali and the cab driver says, "What is your caste?" And it was like, why are you asking me the caste? You feel a little, but caste is a way of life for them.
Right.
They have not, they don't practice the some of the casteism that we have in India.
Right.
They mingle with other castes. They have their pujas, and it doesn't matter.
Right.
They just accept the hierarchy of caste without the negatives of the caste-based system.
Right.
So, and then there are economies evolved around that. In these places, there are still the flower guy who brings flowers and keeps it. So you spend money monthly on somebody who's going to bring fresh flowers to you every day for your thing. So there's the whole economy around these temples, which you described happening in South India, continues in these Southeast Asian countries too.
Yeah, and that's what I define as the dharmic ecosystem, right? One is the temple as an institution by itself, right? The temple as an institution has its own, say, revenue, because people go into the temple, they pay for pujas or whatever it is. And then there is an entire revenue created out of the temple as an entity, right? As a religious entity. But as an extension of what the temple is, there's an entire ecosystem around the temple, right? In terms of, say, shops, in terms of tourism, in terms of people coming, even today, in many of the villages, right? I mean, most of the villages, especially in southern India, the central sort of engine of economic apparatus is a major temple. And then there are sub-temples around. And they sort of are the sort of underpinning economic hub of that particular region, right? I mean, let's take, for example, in the United States, right? If you take some of these educational institutions, let's take Cornell University or Urbana-Champaign, most of them are basically university towns, right? But there's one university which is central, and that university basically runs the entire economy of that town. And then that town becomes popular. In a similar vein, but not a direct one-to-one fit, you find that a lot of these temples are already there. I mean, thousands of temples are already there at the moment, and they serve a very important purpose for defining that village or that community. And this is part of what I call the decentralized model, because you sort of decentralize all this to the village communities, and there is an economic activity hub happening because of that. Similarly, I mean, this is, in those times, if you really look at it, the temples played like 4 important roles, right? One is they were, large employment generators, which means because of the fact that they owned a lot of land, there was a lot of employment created because of the temple, right? Not just the religious part of it, but the non-religious part of it. Second is they served as financial institutions, right? There's a reason why a lot of the temples, major temples in Bharat even today, are all within, say, an hour and a half from the coastal line. Because these temples were serving as banks and financial institutions to enable commerce. So the temples, for example, would lend out money to a lot of these traders and shrinis at a particular interest rate, for example, right? And they would use that interest rate for their maintenance or for some other social activity, right? So what I'm trying to say is they played a very important role as financial institutions. They also played an important role as what I call a VC or a venture capital fund does today, where they had the potential to sort of invest in entities and promote some level of commerce. So they had that role as well. Lastly, they had a very important role, which happens even today, is what I call the redistributive role, right? We all hear about inequality, right? In very simple terms, inequality is basically the gap between the rich and the poor, right? So the more the gap is between a rich and a poor, the more people say there's inequality in society. So you ideally want to provide support to the poor so that you try to reduce the gap. So especially, for example, in the Vijayanagar Empire, if you look at the plates in the Tirupati temple, it clearly states that a lot of these temples were endowment-led financing. That is basically what happens is a bunch of rich people, say in the community, invest as an endowment into the temple.
Do subscribe to the ANI Clips channel to get shorter versions of this podcast. Click here to watch the full episode.